listened to Anthrax demo Soldiers of Metal, he wasn't super enthused about it. The thing was, he also knew that Scott Ian had used $2,500 of his bar mitzvah money to produce the demo, so Johnny, against his better judgment, released it. He was then surprised when the 2,000 copies he had made of the demo sold in under 3 weeks, success that led him to signing Anthrax to his fledgling Megaforce Records, who would then release their 1984 debut album Fistful of Metal. Their follow-up 1985 Spreading Disease would, like Metallica's Ride the Lightning, see them signing to a major label who then re-released the album. However, Anthrax's real breakthrough seems to have been 1987's Among the Living, which is most notable for songs like I Am the Law and Indians. Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax would then become known as the Big Four of thrash metal, although some would argue that Exodus, Kirk Hammett's former band, should have a place alongside those other groups. Now, prior to his departure, Kirk had been the group's primary songwriter. In fact, in a lot of ways, Exodus had been primarily his band. With his departure to join Metallica, though, Gary Holt would take over, and it became more his and Paul Baloff's group. The band, though, would suffer a number of setbacks, starting with their influential 1985 debut album Bonded by Blood, as it had been fully recorded and set to go in 1984, but would not be released for a full year due to various delays and complications. Scott Ian of Anthrax, in fact, feels that Bonded by Blood might actually have been the best of any of the original thrash debut albums, which is why he thinks it's unfair to leave them out of discussions of the most important thrash bands from that time. Ron Quintana has even suggested that had it been released on time, it might have quote-unquote scooped Metallica, which, if he means it, may have put them at least on the same level as Metallica in those early days, maybe. My problem with this argument is when he goes further into Fantasyland by suggesting that they would have then released a second album that would have been better than Ride the Lightning, which, even putting aside any opinion you might have of that record, is oddly confident about something that didn't actually happen, especially since, from what I can tell, Exodus's actual second album is not all that highly considered. Now, what I do think is fair to say is that they likely would have had a better shot of getting more recognition without the various delays that plagued their early years, as in addition to Bonded by Blood, their second album, Pleasures of the Flesh, would not come out until 1987, by which time Metallica and Slayer had already released their third albums. Without these delays, which included Paul Baloff being fired, Exodus might have had a better chance at the very least of maintaining their momentum and remaining in the conversation with the other leading thrash bands. Soon there would even be a second wave of Bay Area thrash bands coming out, headlined by groups like Testament, even though that band had actually formed back in 1982 under the name Legacy. Meanwhile, come 1986, Metallica, who were now signed with Elektra Records, would release their aforementioned third album, Master of Puppets, a release that is generally considered to be one of the greatest metal albums of all time. A big reason why this album was as good as it is was because, despite now being on a major label, Metallica did not change who they were or what they were about in response. Indeed, they followed much of the same blueprint they had established with Ride the Lightning and just looked to improve upon it. The songs were incredibly fast and furious in nature, but their speed was married with technical execution and prog rock-like compositions. The songs were long and complex with numerous ever-changing riffs in each. They also continued their serious lyrical trend, which then offset the long instrumental sections. For example, Disposable Heroes is an anti-war song dealing with the foolishness of soldiers throwing their lives away, while the title track deals with addiction. They also took aim at the televangelist with Leper Messiah, a lyric actually inspired by a David Bowie song. Meanwhile, they also thumbed their noses at the PMRC, when in early pressings of the album, they mocked the group with a sticker warning against playing Damage Inc. because of, quote, multiple uses of the infamous F-word, before providing multiple examples of the other objectionable words that were not on the album. Master of Puppets for some was thrash metal and heavy metal in general at its peak. Additionally, it was with this release that Metallica actually started closing the gap with the commercial and MTV-friendly metal acts, something that happened in no small part due to their going on tour and opening for one of the founding fathers of heavy metal, Ozzy Osbourne. It was, after all, during this tour that Master of Puppets became the first Metallica record to go gold, selling over 500,000 copies. Metallica was finding real success and they were doing things their own way. They made no attempts to try and follow the temporary trends of the day. Instead, they looked to create something timeless, with their attitude being they would do their thing and the people would come to them. And if you want to know more about that album and its creation, check out my Sound Stories episode on it. Slayer, meanwhile, was following much the same path and staying true to themselves and their own vision. It's just their vision involved being heavier, faster, and more chaotic than anyone else. Slayer would reach their peak in sheer speed with Rain and Blood, which was released in the same year as Master of Puppets. Rain and Blood is a furious and brutal record that sounds constantly like everything is about to fall apart, since they're playing so much on the ragged edge of their ability. The songs on this album are fairly short, partially because of the speed at which they were played and because guitarists Kerry King and Jeff Hanneman both grew bored playing the same riff more than a few times each. Lyrically, Slayer continued to stay true to the dark and evil subject matter that they were known for, with songs about an angel cast out of heaven destroying purgatory and the real-life horrors of Nazi Dr. Mengele. That song in particular, which opens the album, would get Slayer into trouble and actually get them kicked off of Columbia Records, even though the song was not about glorifying the Nazis and their crimes, but just about illustrating the horrors of what they had done. Regardless, just like Master of Puppets, Rain and Blood is seen as one of the most important metal records of all time. Meanwhile, in that same year, Megadeth would also release their sophomore album Peace Sells But Who's Buying, which was a more mature offering than their debut. As with the other thrash bands, you could hear a growth in the band from album to album. Most notably, the title track of this album seems to be a response to the political climate of the day, a topic that the other leading thrash bands had for the most part avoided. This was potentially a risky move, but the video for the song would become a mainstay on MTV. Megadeth then had gone where the other thrash bands had refused to tread, and it had paid off. Peace Sells would also notably be the last album for Garl Samuelson and Chris Poland. I told you those positions would become a revolving door. In their cases, though, the firing was understandable, as they had reportedly sold the band's equipment to fuel their heroin addiction. To be clear, the other two members of the band were both heavy users as well, but weren't apparently as far gone as Samuelson and Poland. Still, they were all struggling financially since they spent most of the money they earned on heroin and speed. Nevertheless, 1986 would go down as a banner year for thrash metal, as all three of these albums are now considered classics. Meanwhile, as the thrash metal bands were pushing musical boundaries with longer, more complex songs and serious subject matter, the MTV heavy metal acts like Motley Crue and Twisted Sister were covering older songs like Smokin' in the Boys' Room and Leader of the Pack, almost as if they were trying to appeal to the groups behind the PMRC by playing music more from their era. Whether this was an attempt to appear safer to such crowds by essentially saying, hey look, we're just like the bands you grew up with, or was just a purely commercial move and I'm just connecting dots that aren't there, I don't know. Regardless, Image continued to be king for the LA-based MTV-friendly bands. While thrash bands like Metallica, Slayer, and Megadeth were competing over who could play heavier and faster, the MTV bands competed over Image, and that often included increasing amounts of makeup, hair product, and spandex. Now, to be clear, you can dress how you want. It's just if that's the most important thing about you as a musician, or if that's the thing you're focusing on the most, I'm personally not going to be that impressed. Even some of the musicians from that scene shake their heads looking back at the kinds of things they were focusing on. For example, Dokken guitarist George Lynch would describe the scene like this, quote, "We were like sheep, very short-sighted, a product of our environment. We'd all go to the same clothing designer, Ray Brown, wear the same makeup. We'd go to others and go, how do they get their hair up that high? I've got to get mine higher." The thing was, what they were doing was successful, just increasingly what they were doing seemed manufactured to be so. The clearest example of how commercial these bands were getting was the phenomenon of the power ballad, and how every glam metal band had to have at least one. The trend, as far as I can tell, started with Motley Crue's Home Sweet Home, a song that effectively doubled their audience, something which the other hair bands and or their labels took note of as more and more songs written in that same style began flooding the airwaves. Power ballads are important to note because before, the typical song these bands wrote, while hedonistic and fairly shallow, was still somewhat rebellious in its nature. But in contrast, the power ballad seemed specifically designed to play not just on rock radio stations, but to cross over onto mainstream pop stations. These were songs seemingly designed to be seen as safe. Now again, I'm not one to fault a band for trying something different. It's just that all of a sudden, every band seemingly had to have a power ballad of their own. More so than ever then, these groups were writing songs with potential airplay in mind. Things really started to get out of control when more and more bands that were obviously following the same formula started popping up from around the nation and coming to LA. Bands like Poison and Danger, for example, would completely skip the step of starting out heavy and dangerous like Motley Crue had been, and instead go straight for the safe, poppy, chart-topping sound of power ballads. The thing is, it was a successful formula, as Poison, despite not being thought of as very talented or good even among their fellow glam metal acts, they would still sell 7 million records in the US during the 80s alone. Their songs were shallow and simply focused on having a good time, yet that's what was popular. The thing was, with the flood of copycat bands all more or less following the same formula for both their music and their looks, it feels like at this point the scene was at risk of oversaturation. Hair metal was at risk of falling into the same trap seemingly every music trend before it had fallen into. Once bands got too much success and began writing solely for profits, people tended to lose interest. But before this could happen, a band would come in and not only become the biggest band in the scene, but breathe new life into it. Guns N' Roses had first formed when guitarist Tracy Guns and drummer Rob Gardner, members of LA Guns, teamed up with members of another glam metal band called Hollywood Rose, namely guitarist Isley Stradlin and his friend Bill Bailey, better known as Axl Rose. Rose had in particular been majorly inspired by Finnish metal band Hanoi Rocks, whose drummer Nicholas Razzle Dingley would die during the group's first trip to LA. Razzle, you see, had been riding with Motley Crue frontman Vince Neil. Neil, who was driving drunk, would lose control of the car and crash into an oncoming vehicle, killing Razzle. Vince Neil, though, never went to jail, thanks to Motley Crue's manager Doc McGee getting him off. As for Guns N' Roses, that group would have several members come and go, before finally settling on the lineup that would make them famous with the release of their debut album 1987's Appetite for Destruction. Now, Appetite wasn't an instant hit, as it would take a year before eventually hitting the top of the Billboard charts. Now, to be clear, Guns N' Roses were not your typical glam metal band. They brought an energy and a sense of danger to the glam metal ranks that had to some extent been drained out of a lot of the other acts. They had in some ways a bit of thrash metal's attitude and grit to go along with the aesthetics that made them perfect for MTV. As such, they kinda gave hair metal a bit of a second wind. So, glam metal would continue its reign atop the charts for the rest of the 80s. It was, in fact, to many, seemingly the soundtrack of the decade, as band after band would sell millions of albums. Quiet Riot, for example, would sell 4 million copies of their breakthrough album Metal Health, while its follow-up Condition Critical would quickly sell another million. Meanwhile, Rat's first 2 albums, Out of the Cellar and Invasion of Your Privacy, would each sell some 2 million copies. As their fellow glam metal pioneers Motley Crue by 1987 had 3 albums, Shout at the Devil, Theater of Pain, and the imaginatively titled Girls, 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 that had each sold at least 2 million copies. Also riding high were Great White, whose debut Once Bitten sold 1 million copies, and its follow-up Twice Shy, I'm deeply annoyed right now, went on to sell another 2 million. Then there's John Bon Jovi, who, since I come from New Jersey, I feel compelled to apologize for him and his 4 platinum albums, and by extension his discoveries of Cinderella and Skid Row. Which is all to say the glam/hair/MTV style of metal was extremely popular and successful. Yet for me, no matter how you cut it, that music also had a definite sleazy quality to it. For example, with earlier British heavy metal, when dealing with love as a subject matter, it tended to involve stories of tragic romance. The glam metal bands, though, were all about sex. Nothing more, nothing less. Women just tended to be objects. Really, it did not seem to matter how sleazy they got. For example, Winger's hit song 17 proudly declared, quote, "Daddy says she's too young, but she's old enough for me." And now I feel like I have to take a shower after reading that. Now again, that's just me saying that, as obviously these groups had a sizable audience. That being said, there was a bit of a tide change brewing, as the tenor of America was maybe not as bright and sunny as some wanted it to seem. Between a recession and scandals like Iran-Contra, the mood in America was starting to shift a bit. As a result, at least a segment of the country were seemingly primed for some more serious and less party-time music. You could actually see some hints of this with the rising popularity of thrash metal. Yet, just as Metallica were reaching new heights in popularity with their 3rd album Master of Puppets going gold, tragedy would strike, when on the night of the 27th of September 1986, the tour bus carrying the band supposedly hit a patch of ice on a frozen Swedish highway, causing the bus to flip over. Hetfield, Ulrich, and Hammett would all be fine, but bassist and musical leader Cliff Burton, only 24 years old, would be killed after being thrown out of the window of the bus as it slid over the frozen ground before coming to a stop atop his lifeless body. The suddenness of the crash, not to mention the inexplicable loss of their brother, stunned and shook the remaining members of the band. Hetfield in particular was in such a state that he walked up and down the road repeatedly in his pajamas, looking for the supposed patch of ice that had caused the crash, suspecting that the driver was really to blame. For Metallica, this was a massive blow. They had lost more than just their bass player. Cliff, you see, had in many ways essentially been a guiding force in their growth as musicians, and most importantly, he had been their friend. They, however, didn't really, by their own admittance, take time to grieve. They just pushed forward, and that meant they needed to find a new bass player. They would then hire Flotsam and Jetsam bassist and songwriter Jason Newsted. For Newsted,